By now, everyone knows about the White Helmets, the State Department's propaganda operation to manufacture consent for the dirty war on Syria. But long before the White Helmets were the Afghan Mujahideen. Quick review, the White Helmets were presented as lovable rescue teams who operated in opposition-held territory in Syria. They also embedded with jihadist groups like al-Nusra, al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, and were financed by US government bodies like USAID. This turned Syria into a made-for-TV war zone, pumping decontextualized war porn into American minds through cable news and Netflix documentaries. This propaganda appealed to the conscience of Western liberals to get them to support US military attacks on Syria like Donald Trump bombing Douma or Khan Sheikhoun, or during the Obama era, the Pentagon and CIA arming competing militias and warlords who were consumed by jihadist groups committed to exterminating minorities. Syria was version 2.0. The original was in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Back then, the US was seeking to overthrow Afghanistan's socialist government that had come to power in the Saur Revolution. It's well known that the US funded the Mujahideen, Islamic fundamentalist holy warriors who were united with the US in their belief that godless communism was the ultimate evil. Of course, we all know how that alliance turned out.
Take a look at videotape just moments ago of the second plane hitting the World Trade Center. That is spectacular pictures.
But at the time, the US public wasn't interested in Afghanistan, a country 7,000 miles away that everyday Americans couldn't find on a map, and news barely covered it. In 1982, the US government sent Hollywood star Kirk Douglas to Peshawar, Pakistan, to film a Thanksgiving special in which he met with Mujahideen leaders, showed the horrors of the Soviet intervention and the plight of Afghan refugees.
I will never forget Soviet strategy to maim and destroy children, nor do the Mujahideen.
But after that effort flopped, the now defunct US propaganda arm known as the US Information Agency, or USIA, sprang into action. Its director, Alvin Snyder, came up with the idea of training Mujahideen in journalism and providing them with video cameras. The articles and footage they provided would bolster the US government's narrative of the Soviet intervention as an invasion of an evil empire and the Afghan holy warriors as freedom fighters that America had to support. Congress passed legislation to train the Mujahideen and allocated $500,000 to set up a journalism school for them. This was done in conjunction with Boston University. The Afghan Media Resource Center was born. Its policy manual specified that every employee be obedient to the Islamic faith and must honestly and generously sacrifice for holy jihad and take an active share in Afghanistan's independence struggle. Trainees were sent into the Afghan battlefield where they captured the realities of wars, dead soldiers on both sides, and unspeakable tragedies. Cable news outlets like CBS and CNN began to air the footage, and US officials later credited their efforts for the eventual Soviet withdrawal. With a gun in one hand and a camera in the other, the Mujahideen propagandists interviewed warlords like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, leader of a guerrilla group known as the Islamic Party, and CIA favorite, who Washington funneled more than $1 billion to as he became the biggest drug lord in Afghanistan. Hekmatyar had a reputation for spraying acid in the faces of women who dared to be in public without covering their heads. His indiscriminate shelling of Kabul during the war against the Soviet-backed government killed 50,000 people and earned him the nickname the Butcher of Kabul. In 2003, after the US invaded Afghanistan, the US designated Hekmatyar as a global terrorist, and his forces waged a fierce insurgency against the US occupation. There's Haji Zaman, a Mujahideen commander and drug lord who, decades after the US supported him, the US accused of helping Osama bin Laden escape from Tora Bora. Here, the then US ambassador to Pakistan described Mujahideen leader Mullah Malang in glowing terms.
He is a very patriotic Afghan. He has contributed a lot to the jihad. He says he is looking forward to contributing more in the future.
In the future, Mullah Malang would go on to become a Taliban leader who ordered suicide attacks against US soldiers. Here's a photo of Jalaluddin Haqqani, a CIA asset during the anti-Soviet jihad. He founded the Haqqani Network, which would become one of the US's fiercest enemies in Afghanistan. Decades later, this very propaganda model would be applied to Syria, but in a much more sophisticated way. The US and EU funded media trainers and provided cameras for propagandists to embed with anti-government armed groups, including the Syrian al-Qaeda branch al-Nusra. In Afghanistan, there was the Afghan Media Resource Center. In Syria, there were numerous media branches. The Aleppo Media Center, funded by the Washington, D.C.-based Syrian Expatriates Organization, which famously posted videos of Omran Daknish, the 4-year-old boy who, against his father's wishes, became a central part of the war propaganda effort. The person who took the infamous photo of Daknish, who became known in U.S. media as Aleppo Boy, was Mahmoud Raslan. Raslan was also a member of a US-funded armed group, Noordin al-Zinki, that beheaded 10-year-old Palestinian boy Abdullah Isa. There was Syria Direct, funded by the State Department and French and Australian embassies. Syria Direct trained numerous journalists whose articles were furnished to US media outlets like USA Today, CNN, and Radio Free Europe. Propaganda has been a key component of every war the US has waged, from Vietnam to Grenada to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. These efforts become more sophisticated and insidious over time. Without them, the US permanent war state simply couldn't operate.